Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the candlelit corridors of European palaces, past velvet curtained bedchambers and echoing stone halls, to meet the daughters of royalty, elegant, poised, and, well, often one eyebrow away from a genetic crisis. You're about to spend the night wandering through a history that most textbooks politely skim over. What centuries of royal inbreeding really did to the young women born into Europe's most powerful dynasties. Imagine you're seated in an embroidered armchair beside a vast marble fireplace, the scent of beeswax and rosewater clinging to the air. Outside, a soft rain taps against stained glass windows. And inside, well, inside, you'll start to notice that the portraits don't quite smile back the way they should. The eyes are dull, the jaws oddly rigid, the family trees less tree and more tangled shrub. Royal blood was considered sacred, too important to be diluted by outsiders, which meant European monarchs often preferred to marry cousins, nieces, and even uncomfortably close aunts. And you, lucky you, are drifting deeper into this candlelit mess of bloodlines, where titles were inherited alongside brittle bones, mental instability, and teeth that seemed to sprout sideways. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is heavy with clove-scented incense and dynastic pressure. It's the 1400s, and you're standing beside a court physician, his hands shaking slightly as he checks a newborn infant's pulse. The child is blue-blooded in every sense. Her mother is a Habsburg princess. Her father is a Habsburg duke. And the family tree? Let's just say it loops back like a snake swallowing its own tail. At the heart of Europe, royal courts weren't just political machines. They were breeding programs. The goal was to preserve power, land, and influence. The cost? Health. Not that anyone knew the term recessive gene yet. All they saw were alliances, contracts sealed in blood, literally. From the very beginning, royal daughters were valued for their ability to marry and produce more royals, which meant your average archduchess wasn't exactly dating around. Her future husband had likely sat across from her at last year's family feast, or was maybe sitting in her lap in the nursery. And so, generation by generation, the same genetic cards kept getting reshuffled and dealt. Sometimes the result was harmless, just a longer nose or a quirk in the eyebrows. But often, it wasn't. You peer into a 16th century birthing room, cool, dark, with rough linen sheets and a midwife muttering a prayer. A princess has just been born, but something is off. Her limbs are stiff. Her breathing is shallow. The court whispers behind closed doors. They'll say it's a divine mystery or a test of faith. What they won't say is that her parents were first cousins and that this is the fourth daughter with similar symptoms. Mainstream historians agree that Europe's royal houses were alarmingly interrelated. In fact, by the time Charles II of Spain was born, his ancestry was so compacted that over 80% of his genes came from just a handful of people. That's not ideal, especially when you're trying to keep a continent running. And here's the thing, they knew. Not the science of it, of course, but they saw the patterns. The feeble children. The girls who didn't survive past childhood. The ones who grew up delicate, emotionally erratic. or simply vanished from court life altogether. Historians still argue whether some daughters were quietly hidden away, sent to convents or isolated villas to live out their short lives in privacy, their existence conveniently brushed from the tapestry. You pass by a hand-stitched royal family genealogy, an artwork in gold thread. It looks grand, regal, but trace the names and dates, and it quickly becomes a horror map. Uncle married niece, cousins married cousins, brothers arranged to marry sisters had the Pope not stepped in. And you realize that behind every coronation portrait was a child born into a web too tightly spun. You pause by a window and look out across Europe, from Spain's golden palaces to the frost-bitten halls of St. Petersburg. In every capital, royal daughters were being dressed in silks, groomed in manners, and handed marriage contracts like legal documents at a job fair. Their lives were brief scripts written by generations of monarchs obsessed with legacy over biology, and yet they were real girls, real women, with hopes, fears, daydreams about love or adventure, slowly dimmed by headaches that never stopped, bones that broke too easily, or minds that became foggy before 20. The physical toll of centuries of closed-loop breeding was rarely discussed out loud, but it was everywhere if you knew where to look. You wander down a gallery of royal portraits now. The faces blur as your eyelids droop. You see noble brows, tilted eyes, expressions that don't quite land. Each one represents a person bred not for joy or fulfillment, but to serve an unspoken rule: never dilute the bloodline. And you realize this isn't a single story. It's 1,000 overlapping lullabies of loss. Each daughter, each duchess, each delicate princess, born with the weight of centuries inside her veins, and often fated to carry it quietly to her grave. You're in a nursery now, lavish but cold. The walls are frescoed with Roman gods and frolicking cherubs, but the atmosphere is far from cheerful. The year is 1550-something, and you're staring into the cradle of a newborn girl swaddled in embroidered linens that weigh almost as much as she does. Her eyes blink slowly under a frilled cap. Her name has already been decided. 3 names, actually, and at least one of them honors an aunt who's also technically her great-grandmother. This is the early life of a royal daughter. A blue baby, they call her, not just for her bloodline, but for the bluish tinge that's worrying the midwife. You watch as the nursemaid turns the child gently, almost too gently, careful not to dislocate anything. It's already known this little one will be fragile. You don't get to pick your genes. And if you were born a princess in Renaissance Europe, your chances of a clean slate were slim. You had better odds of inheriting a kingdom than healthy hip sockets. That's not hyperbole. In many royal lines, the same names appear again and again: Charles, Maria, Ferdinand, Isabella, as though mixing up the monograms would have been too adventurous. The obsession with pure bloodline meant cousins married cousins with dizzying frequency. You imagine a court scribe sketching out the latest family tree and pausing, quill hovering, when he realizes the bride is marrying her uncle's son again. Your guide tonight? The Habsburgs, of course, the reigning champions of genetic déjà vu. Their motto might as well have been, "Don't look outside the family. We've got everything we need right here, including the jaw." You float over to a hallway filled with creaking portraits, sepia-toned oil paintings of little girls in velvet gowns holding tiny dogs or staring blankly into the middle distance. Many wouldn't live long enough to marry. Others would be promised to boys just as inbred as they were. A few would go mad, and a rare few would somehow thrive. But make no mistake, from infancy, these girls were viewed less as children and more as dynastic investments. You weren't Maria Theresa's daughter. You were the Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, potential bride of Bavaria, a walking treaty, a dowry with ankles. You sit for a moment beside an early modern physician, scribbling case notes in terrible Latin. He's describing a royal girl who hasn't grown an inch in a year and has an alarming habit of fainting during embroidery lessons. He prescribes fresh air and a change of scenery. No one suggests that her parents are first cousins once removed, and also first cousins twice re-added, because that would be awkward. Historians still argue whether these maladies were ever connected in people's minds to the family trees that loop tighter with every generation. Some records hint that whispers existed, that even then, people noticed how weak the royal children were becoming. But public acknowledgement? Not a chance. Monarchs were divinely ordained. Suggesting they had bad genes would have been like accusing God of a typo. Still, you find clues. Here's a letter from a royal governess mentioning the little one's breathlessness and trouble walking. There's a court diary entry remarking on the peculiar way young Princess Isabella tilts her head, as though her neck can't quite support the weight of her crown. And then there are the babies, who simply vanish from the record. Born, named, baptized, and never mentioned again. Some were quietly buried in convent cemeteries. Others were kept alive but hidden away in remote estates. A few were even passed off as maids of the bedchamber, raised alongside their sisters, but never officially acknowledged. You notice, too, how language softened the truth. A princess wasn't described as deformed. She was gracefully delicate. A royal daughter with seizures had a mystical nature. Those who couldn't bear children were often declared too pious for marriage. It all sounds prettier than unsuitable due to chronic inbreeding. Of course, not every ailment was genetic. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles ravaged all social classes, and the royal courts were far from hygienic. But the difference was that the lower classes didn't keep marrying their own uncles generation after generation. And yes, your modern brain is screaming at this point, because you know how genes work. You've seen the Punnett squares. But for these people, blood was sacred. The idea of marrying someone without a noble lineage felt like pouring well water into a bottle of vintage wine. Dilution was worse than disease. So they rolled the dice, over and over. And each time a daughter was born, the hope was the same, that this one would be healthy, that this one would marry well, that this one wouldn't carry the curse. You reach out to the cradle again, watching as the newborn stirs. The nurse whispers a lullaby in an old dialect. Outside, church bells toll the hour. Inside, destiny wraps its fingers tighter around another girl who never asked to be born into this elaborate biological experiment. She'll grow up surrounded by luxury, gold-threaded tapestries, hand-carved toys, the finest tutors. But inside her, a quiet war may already be unfolding. A missing enzyme, a weakened valve, a jaw that will never quite close, and nobody will say it out loud, but everyone will see it. You find yourself descending into the opulent gloom of El Escorial, Spain's royal monastery palace complex. The air is cool and still, and your footsteps echo on marble floors. You're here to meet the most infamous victims of royal inbreeding, the Spanish Habsburgs. If inbreeding had a final boss, it was this dynasty. You stroll past rows of portraits, and the family resemblance hits you like a velvet-wrapped brick. Every face carries that telltale Habsburg jaw, massive, jutting, almost cartoonishly square. These were rulers with chins that defied gravity and mouths that sometimes couldn't close. But that's not just a quirky family trait. It's a clue to centuries of dangerously tight genetic spiraling. You pause before a grand painting of Charles II of Spain, known in hushed voices as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His gaze is distant, his lips slack, his body draped in regal fabrics that try and fail to make him look powerful. Born in 1661, Charles was the tragic final note in the Spanish Habsburg Symphony. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was more like a wreath. He had fewer great-grandparents than most people have grandparents. Charles II was the product of over 2 centuries of close-kin marriages. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were cousins. And tucked into nearly every generation was a marriage that would make modern genealogists throw their laptops into the sea. Historians still argue whether Charles's extreme physical and cognitive challenges were solely caused by inbreeding, but let's just say the evidence is pretty damning. He was unable to speak clearly, suffered from multiple disabilities, couldn't walk until he was nearly 8, and never fathered a child despite 2 marriages. His autopsy reportedly revealed that his body was in a state of advanced decay at death. He was just 38, but his organs told a different story. And it wasn't just Charles. You take a moment to imagine the young royal daughters born into this genetic loop. Many never lived long enough to be painted. Others were married off while still teenagers, bundled up like diplomatic packages. Some were physically weak, some mentally unstable. Most were shuttled into alliances meant to preserve empires, but ended up quietly eroding them from within. One of the more haunting examples, the sisters of Charles II. You pass their portraits in silence. Maria Theresa, who became Queen of France by marrying Louis XIV, escaped the worst of the genetic lottery, but her children did not. Margaret Teresa, the famous subject of Las Meninas by Velázquez, died at just 21, after birthing 4 children in quick succession, only one of whom survived, and only briefly. You can almost hear the whispers in the corridors. Ladies-in-waiting quietly noting the princess's narrow chest, the way she wheezes after dancing, the stiffness in her limbs. But no one dared question the family's choices. Instead, they'd wrap the issues in euphemism, sensitive constitution, spiritual temperament, not suited for courtly duties, anything but genetically doomed. You trail a finger along a dusty ledger, its pages filled with marriage contracts, all signed with elegant loops and wax seals. These documents weren't love stories. They were survival tactics. But ironically, the more the Habsburgs tried to keep it in the family, the weaker that family became. Their daughters paid for those decisions with their health, their futures, and often their lives. And here's where it gets particularly dark. While the Habsburg men often received the historical spotlight, Charles with his tragic reign, Philip II with his empire, it was the women who bore the daily burden. They were the ones expected to produce healthy heirs, to carry pregnancies despite their own deformities, to smile through public ceremonies when their joints ached or their minds wandered. You imagine a court physician pressing his ear to a princess's chest, hearing a heart murmur he can't explain. You see a young archduchess fumbling with her embroidery, her fingers too stiff to manage the needle. You hear court gossip about a royal bride who sleeps too much, and doesn't speak unless spoken to. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns, one so consistent, it's a wonder the dynasty didn't stop and say, you know what, let's try marrying outside the family for once. But no, the goal was purity, not diversity, and the price was steep. Modern geneticists have analyzed the Habsburg family tree and confirmed what the portraits already suggested: the inbreeding coefficient, basically a score for how genetically similar your parents are, was astronomically high. Charles II's score was over 0.25. For comparison, the child of a brother and sister would have a score of 0.25. So, yeah. And yet, the dynasty endured. For a while. You stand now in the darkening corners of El Escorial's crypt, where generations of Habsburgs rest. The silence is thick, almost reverent, but there's a sense that the silence is also hiding something. A long echo of choices made in candlelit rooms, behind closed doors, in the name of power. You realize that the daughters entombed here were once little girls, with dolls and tutors and dreams. And for many, those dreams never reached adulthood. Their bodies failed them, their minds betrayed them. And all because their ancestors couldn't stop marrying their cousins. You linger a moment longer. Outside, the wind brushes the cypress trees. Inside, 1,000 years of bloodlines curl into stillness. You're walking now through the painted halls of a Spanish palace. But it's not the opulence that holds your attention. It's the silence behind closed doors. The kind of quiet that suggests someone is being kept out of sight. Or kept in. Her name is Joanna, or Juana, as she's called here. And depending on who you ask, she was either a tragic heroine, a misunderstood mystic, or completely insane. But tonight, you aren't judging. You're simply watching a royal daughter unravel under the weight of everything that came before her. Juana of Castile was born in 1479 to Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Yes, that Isabella and Ferdinand. She was intelligent, deeply religious, and politically important. So naturally, her personal well-being took a backseat to dynastic ambitions. At age 16, she was married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a man known for his looks, not his loyalty. Historians still argue whether Juana was mentally ill from the start, or if grief and isolation cracked her open over time. But what's clear is that her story fits the pattern. She exhibited intense emotional swings, deep depression, and later, something close to delusion. After Philip's death, she reportedly carried his corpse around for weeks, refusing burial, convinced he'd wake again. It sounds like Gothic fiction. But no, this was the future Queen of Spain, slowly dissolving behind palace gates. You sit beside her in the chilly monastery she was confined to, her royal title intact, her freedom gone. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a convenient label for a woman whose family couldn't understand her pain and didn't want to face the possibility that it ran in the blood. Because if she was mad, it was easier to lock her away than confront the possibility that something in the Habsburg genes was misfiring. Easier to blame grief than acknowledge that the same facial features repeating in every royal portrait might be accompanied by something more dangerous, a predisposition to mental instability. This wasn't unique to Juana. Royal daughters across Europe began to exhibit similar signs: severe mood swings, hallucinations, deep melancholia. They weren't called depressed, of course. They were described as suffering divine afflictions, melancholic humors, or stricken by spiritual torments. Basically, 16th century euphemisms for something is seriously wrong, but let's not name it. You pass through the years like pages turning in a velvet-bound book. A princess in Austria refuses to eat, convinced her food is poisoned. A French duchess speaks only to angels for months on end. A Bavarian countess scratches at her skin, trying to let out the sadness. And all the while, physicians scribble furiously, prescribing leeches, lavender, and long rides in the countryside. Sometimes these royal daughters were hidden. Sometimes they were sent to convents for their peace of mind. Sometimes they were married anyway, pushed into alliances like broken pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, hoped to fit together just enough to produce an heir. But Juana, she was crowned queen, and then quietly imprisoned by her father, and later her son, for over 40 years. She ruled nothing but the stone walls of her chambers. You imagine her pacing, muttering, folding and unfolding the same silk handkerchief over and over, waiting for a letter that would never arrive, listening for a door that never opened. You step back from her story and realize it wasn't an isolated incident. Juana may have been the Mad Queen, but she wasn't the only one whose mind buckled under the pressures of royal genetics. She just had the misfortune of being too prominent to fully erase. Meanwhile, other daughters faded more quietly. Their conditions were folded into court gossip or buried beneath layers of etiquette and formality. A nervous laugh here, a glassy stare there. One more girl who wasn't quite right. It's easy to romanticize monarchy, all the gowns, jewels, and ballroom intrigue. But behind the fantasy were real people and real suffering. The palaces were beautiful, yes, but they also doubled as gilded cages for girls born into a system that cared more about keeping bloodlines pure than keeping minds sound. And when the girls broke, the system didn't. It just buried them deeper. You return to Juana one last time, watching as she kneels beside a wooden crucifix, whispering prayers into the dark. Outside her chamber window, the world changed. Monarchies rose and fell. Maps redrew themselves, but she remained, a daughter of empires, trapped in a body and mind her ancestors built for her, brick by brick, gene by gene. Sleep doesn't come easily to royalty, not when madness is a family heirloom. You find yourself standing in the echoing vestibule of Nymphenburg Palace, Bavaria. Marble arches loom above you, and crystal chandeliers twinkle with ghostly light. This place once housed dreams of grandeur and royal spectacle. But you're not here for a coronation or a masquerade. You're here for the faint outline of a young woman who never made it to the altar, Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria. Her name may not appear in many textbooks, but her life, brief, bittersweet, and carefully edited, tells you plenty about what inbreeding, expectation, and heartbreak could do to a royal daughter. She was meant to become Empress of Austria. Instead, she became a ghost in the footnotes. Born in 1847, Sophie Charlotte was a cousin to Mad King Ludwig II, the fairy tale-obsessed monarch who built castles straight out of bedtime stories. You walk now along the path Sophie once took, a promenade lined with manicured hedges and hedged expectations. Her marriage to Austria's Archduke Maximilian was arranged with all the usual pomp and familial overlapping. Maximilian was also a Habsburg, because of course he was. You drift into her sitting room, where a lace handkerchief lies forgotten on the writing desk. Sophie had reservations about the match. Some sources say she refused the engagement. Others hint that Maximilian's mother found Sophie lacking. The truth, as usual, is stitched together from rumors and royal silence. But what's known is that the engagement ended, and Sophie once destined to be an empress, began to vanish from the spotlight. You might think she was free, that dodging a Habsburg marriage was a kind of escape. But royalty doesn't leave much room for free will. Not in the 19th century. Not for daughters. Her public image grew dimmer, more fragile. Court observers noted her sensitive constitution, her tendency toward solitude, and her sudden death at the age of 23. Cause of death? Officially, pneumonia. Unofficially, there are whispers of heartbreak, depression, or some undiagnosed illness that may have been whispered about in the family but never addressed. You pause beside her death mask, pale, serene, and far too young. Another royal daughter extinguished without scandal, but not without sorrow. And here's the chilling part. Sophie wasn't an exception. She was a template. The fragile royal daughter archetype was almost a genre by the late 1800s. Pale, graceful, prone to illness, more poetry than person, more symbol than soul. You're in Vienna now, following Sophie's cousins. The Habsburg daughters of this era were often praised in public and ignored in private. They lived behind lace curtains and diplomatic smiles. When they showed signs of mental strain or merely disagreed with a marriage plan, they were labeled difficult, melancholic, or simply unsuitable. Take Princess Gisela, daughter of Emperor Franz Joseph. She was lucky enough to marry for love, but only because her parents weren't willing to risk another high-profile disaster. Even so, her diaries hint at isolation and anxiety. Her sister, Marie Valerie, was micromanaged to the point of madness by their mother, Empress Elizabeth. Herself a complicated figure known for disordered eating, wild beauty routines, and crushing loneliness. Historians still debate how much of Elizabeth's turmoil was personal and how much was hereditary. You drift from room to room, powder rooms, writing salons, reading nooks, each more lavish than the last, and yet each humming with a kind of quiet grief. These girls were draped in silk, schooled in French poetry, and often medically fragile by the age of 10. Tall for their age, perhaps, but stooped by migraines. Bright-eyed, but prone to fainting. Royal from head to toe, but carrying generations of faulty DNA stitched invisibly beneath the skin. Imagine growing up knowing your only real task is to marry someone who is probably your second cousin, and possibly your genetic twin. And if you decline, you risk being written out of history or quietly placed into a convent with a generous dowry and no forwarding address. One of Sophie Charlotte's surviving letters is rumored to end with the words, "I dreamed of a sea with no shore and no crown." A poetic thought, or maybe just the sleep-deprived murmurings of someone who saw too far ahead and didn't like what she saw. You leave the palace now and walk the garden paths under a gray Bavarian sky. The roses are still blooming, the fountains still babble, and yet everything feels steeped in waiting, as though even the trees remember her. Duchess Sophie died young, unmarried, and largely forgotten by the public. But her story lives quietly in the margins, like so many royal daughters who never fit the mold, and therefore were never allowed to flourish. She was supposed to be part of the great dynastic puzzle. When she wasn't, the system simply closed around her absence, and so she became another name on the marble wall, another silk dress sealed in a museum closet, another whisper that disappears into the hedges. The halls of Schönbrunn Palace feel colder tonight, not from weather, but from memory. You're gliding past portrait after portrait, each one stiffer than the last, all lined in gold, and bearing the same names over and over: Maria, Josepha, Teresa, Anna. If you're getting deja vu, you're not alone. The Habsburgs had a habit of recycling names and genes with an almost obsessive focus. And here, tucked into the corner of an ornate gallery, is a lesser-known daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, Maria Anna. You lean closer to her painting. She doesn't smile. Her gaze is stern, her jawline notably sharp. But this isn't just another 18th century archduchess preparing for a strategic marriage. Number. This one never got that far. Maria Anna was born in 1738, the first child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis Further. She was baptized in great splendor, of course, because nothing says welcome to life like powdered wigs and 27 godparents. But from the start, there were signs. She had trouble walking. Her spine curved oddly. She fell ill often, and she didn't quite fit the role she'd been born into. In any other family, this would have been tragic. In the Habsburg dynasty, it was inconvenient. You see, Maria Theresa had 16 children. 16. Most of them were pawns in the enormous chessboard of European politics. Each daughter was a future duchess, queen, or empress. But Maria Anna, she was politely removed from play. You visit her rooms now, far from the center of court life, modest by royal standards, quiet, furnished with piety and piano lessons. They say she was brilliant, passionate about theology and philosophy, a skilled musician. But brilliance meant little if you couldn't carry a royal pregnancy or stand at attention during a 6-hour mass without fainting. She was eventually sent to Klagenfurt, where she served as abbess of a convent. Don't be fooled by the title. It wasn't a promotion. It was exile in silk. She wore habits instead of gowns, and her conversations were with nuns instead of diplomats. From there, she wrote letters, warm, curious, and often tinged with resignation. She was out of sight, but she wasn't blind. She knew why she'd been shuffled away. Historians still argue whether her removal from court was primarily due to physical disability, intellectual incompatibility with the system, or some hidden illness no one wanted to name. But the result was the same. She vanished from royal responsibility without ever being allowed to refuse it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Maria Anna wasn't the only one. She was part of a quiet procession of daughters born with delicate constitutions, as court physicians phrased it, women who were intellectually capable but physically unsuitable for the marriage markets. And what do you do with a royal woman who can't marry? You either bury her in a convent or you never mention her again. The Habsburg obsession with legacy didn't allow for deviations. Daughters had to be healthy, beautiful, and marriageable. If they were intelligent, that was a nice bonus, provided they didn't start writing pamphlets. But if they were sickly, or disabled, or simply not photogenic enough to command a dowry, the system had no place for them. You look back at the portrait of Maria Anna now. Her dress is modest. Her hair is coiled into a halo of obedience. But her eyes are vivid, smarter than the frame allows. You imagine her at a harpsichord, playing Bach with precision, smiling only when no one is watching. You imagine her in the convent garden, praying, not out of piety, but out of boredom. You imagine her reading treatises late at night while the abbey bells toll over the Tyrolean hills. Was she content? Maybe. Was she safe? Likely. Was she allowed to become the person she might have been outside the crushing expectations of dynastic continuity? Absolutely not. One account from the time mentions that she had a slight deformity of the spine. Another says she walked with a limp. One more mentions she was unsuited for courtly display, but none question whether she mattered. That's where you come in, slipping through time to listen when others didn't. You pass through her final resting place now, a crypt far quieter than the others. No grand epitaph, just a name. She was the firstborn daughter of an empress. She was brilliant. She was forgotten. And so the pattern repeats. A royal girl born into glory, pushed gently out of view, her story folded behind a velvet curtain. The convent doors close softly behind you. The candles flicker once. Maria Anna, like so many before and after, deserved a crown. She got silence instead. You're walking now through a hallway lined with oil portraits, some faded, some disturbingly lifelike. All of them stare back with one shared feature, that unmistakable Habsburg jaw. It's not subtle. In profile, it juts out like a misplaced architectural flourish. Straight on, it turns smiles into sneers. The mouth doesn't close fully. The lips look stretched. The chins, plural. This is mandibular prognathism, the most famous physical hallmark of Habsburg inbreeding. And tonight, you're tracing its legacy through a parade of royal daughters who inherited it like a family heirloom no one could return. You stop before a 17th century portrait of Archduchess Maria Maddalena. Her dress is lavish, yes. The lace, hand-stitched. The brocade, imported. But it's her mouth you can't stop looking at. A jaw so protruded, she seems permanently mid-sentence. At the time, it was considered distinctive. Now, we'd call it a textbook genetic defect. Historians and medical researchers have since connected this distinct facial structure directly to generations of close kin marriages within the Habsburg line. And while the male rulers often get the spotlight for their exaggerated jaws, Charles II, Charles V, Philip IV, the daughters inherited the same trait. They just weren't painted as often. Or, when they were, artists softened their features, adjusted the angles, flattered the chin, because even the truth could be made presentable. You lean closer to a portrait of Princess Maria Anna of Spain. Her lower lip is visibly heavy, her jawline sharp and awkward. Letters from the time politely describe her as not classically beautiful. Translated, her face was shaped by centuries of strategic inbreeding, and there wasn't enough rouge in the kingdom to hide it. You imagine these girls learning early to smile with their mouths closed, to turn their faces just so in portraits, to accept the endless fittings of velvet veils, not just for modesty, but to obscure what their genetics had made plain. There's a strange poetry to it. These young women were bred, yes, bred, for perfection, to be symbols of dynastic purity. But the very effort to preserve that purity ended up painting it across their faces like a warning label. And it wasn't just looks. The jaw often came bundled with complications, misaligned teeth, breathing difficulties, speech impairments, digestive issues from poorly chewed food. Imagine being a teenage archduchess, dressed in yards of brocade, hosting a foreign prince over dinner, and being unable to chew a bite of pheasant without wincing. Now, imagine doing it every day. One of the few surviving records from a court physician mentions a young Habsburg princess, name redacted, who had difficulty speaking due to her angular mandible. Another mentions that she could only consume soft pastries. Yet she was still presented at court, still photographed, still expected to marry and carry on the line. Historians still argue whether this specific jaw trait became more extreme because of particularly tight cousin marriages, or whether it simply compounded over time with no outside genetic input. Either way, the result was clear: a facial structure so recognizably flawed that it became synonymous with a dynasty. But here's the quiet part, the part most people skip: how the women handled it. There are personal letters, sometimes overlooked, that show flashes of humor, resilience, even sarcasm. One princess writes to her sister, "The court painter has tried again. He has given me a chin like our father, but at least now I can hold a spoon under it." You smile in the dark. Royal sarcasm, alive and well. Another daughter, raised in the Austrian branch of the family, reportedly requested that no profile portraits be painted of her after age 12. Her request was granted. Instead, she was shown head-on, framed with cascading curls, lips pursed demurely, beauty through creative angles. You step into a royal dressing chamber where a young duchess stares into a gilded mirror. Two attendants adjust her hair while another laces her corset. But her eyes aren't on the gown. They're fixed on her reflection, particularly the mouth she can't quite close. You wonder what she's thinking. If she knows. If she resents it. If she understands that the very feature she's been taught to accept with grace is also the punchline of every foreign ambassador's letter home. And here's the twist. These girls were rarely seen as sick, not publicly. The jaw wasn't illness. It was distinction, a physical sign of noble heritage. It meant your family had ruled for centuries, that your lineage was pure. Never mind that it also meant jaw surgery would have been required if you'd been born into any other class. You return to the portrait gallery, and suddenly every frame feels heavier. Not just because of what they show, but because of what they hide. The smiles that don't quite smile. The eyes that seem to know they've been bred for duty, not health. And the jaws. The unmistakable, sculpted reminders of what happens when you value bloodlines more than biology. So next time you see an old royal portrait and feel tempted to admire the elegance, look again. Look closely. Look past the lace and the lilies and the flattering brushstrokes. Because somewhere behind that half smile is a jaw that tells the entire story. And a young woman who had no choice but to bear it with grace. It's early morning now, and you find yourself in a dim, candlelit chapel in Vienna. The altar glows faintly with flickering gold. A veiled figure kneels in the front pew. Silent, motionless, her hands folded with tight purpose. She's a Habsburg daughter, barely 16, already betrothed, already prepared to leave her homeland for a kingdom she's never seen. Her name is Maria Leopoldina. You drift closer. Her veil trembles slightly, perhaps from the cold, or perhaps from nerves she's learned not to show. The prayer isn't for peace or joy, it's for strength. She's about to be married off to a man across the Atlantic. A stranger, but also, of course, a relative. You follow her through the long voyage, weeks at sea, locked in a floating museum of lace, tea sets, and seasickness. In 1817, she sails to Brazil to marry Pedro I, heir to the Portuguese crown. It's a powerful match, a diplomatic chess move. And like so many royal daughters before her, Maria Leopoldina is sacrificed to the strategy. She becomes Empress of Brazil. Her letters from those early years reveal a careful optimism, followed by exhaustion, then despair. Her husband is unfaithful. The court is alien, the climate punishing. She bears child after child despite chronic illness. Her final pregnancy, her seventh, is too much. She dies at just 29. Some say it was fever. Some say a miscarriage. Others whisper of a broken spirit. But Leopoldina was considered one of the lucky ones. She fulfilled her role. married well, produced heirs, died noble. The bar was set tragically low. You begin to notice the pattern. The farther the empire stretched, the farther these daughters were shipped. They were born in castles and died in climates that didn't care who their fathers were. And yet, the expectations never changed. They were vessels, carriers of treaties, bearers of dynasties. If they smiled in their portraits, all the better. If not, well, that was an artist's job. You pass now into the chambers of Archduchess Marie Caroline, who fared worse than most. Born into the late 1700s, another of Maria Theresa's brood, she was married off to Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, a cousin, naturally. He was reportedly slow-witted and unstable, but no one questioned the match, not publicly. Behind closed doors, their marriage was a horror story. Ferdinand was crude, possibly violent. Caroline, intelligent and politically ambitious, was trapped. She gave birth to 18 children, many of whom died young. Her letters are filled with despair, cloaked in diplomatic politesse. She tried to maintain a court, uphold alliances, and raise children while navigating madness, both inherited and marital. Historians still debate whether Caroline's political sharpness delayed her psychological unraveling or merely gave her a longer fall. What's undeniable is that she lived a life built on compromises that eventually unraveled her health. One by one, her children fell ill. Some died. She survived, technically. But survival in these stories is a low bar. And what about the ones we don't talk about? The daughters who didn't even make it to marriage age. You trace your fingers along a royal nursery wall where tiny portraits hang, some just silhouettes. These were the stillborns, the fever victims, the delicate ones. Girls who never had a chance because their genes had already been rigged against them. One little girl, Maria Josefa, is said to have died of smallpox just before her wedding to the French Dauphin. But some letters hint at something else, a delay, a lingering illness. Was it smallpox? Or a cover for another form of weakness that disqualified her from the dynastic game? You'll never know. That's the nature of these records. They're polite, sanitized, desperate to maintain the illusion that the system was working, even when it was quietly folding in on itself. There's a loneliness that creeps in here, an understanding that for all the grandeur, these girls often died alone, far from home, far from kindness, their stories buried in footnotes, their faces remembered only if they managed to produce a king, and even then, only vaguely. You linger in a room filled with wedding portraits. Every face wears the same expression, still, reserved, almost serene. But behind the varnish lies a world of unspoken pain, jaw aches, stomach cramps, fainting spells, mental fog. Behind the eyes, the echoes of cousin after cousin whispering through the bloodstream. And yet, when one daughter fell, another was raised. The cycle never stopped. A duchess dies in childbirth, and the next sister is fitted for her gown. A princess collapses during a ball, and the court simply redirects attention to her cousin, who is conveniently the same age. There's always another daughter. You pause at a mirror now, one gilded and cracked, and for a moment, your own reflection flickers with their features. Not just the eyes or the hair, but the weariness, the quiet knowledge of a role you never chose. The weight of centuries pressing down like a crown that never fits. You turn away, and the hallway stretches before you again. You walk on, deeper into the shadows of a dynasty that kept asking too much of its daughters. and kept getting less in return. You're standing in front of a train station now, not a palace, not a crypt, but a station. The year is 1898, and Europe is changing fast. Monarchies are nervous. Empires are cracking. The old ways are being challenged by newspapers, railroads, and people who ask too many questions. But one thing hasn't changed. Royal daughters are still being shipped off like fine porcelain, fragile, expensive, and expected to arrive intact. Here steps off Princess Stephanie of Belgium, daughter of King Leopold II. She's 19, stiff-backed, and already bracing herself for the next chapter. Her father, cold and controlling, and, let's be honest, a monster when it came to his Congo policies, has arranged her marriage to Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, son of Emperor Franz Joseph and the famously tragic Empress Elizabeth. You follow her into the carriages bound for Vienna, where everything smells like perfume and gunpowder. Stephanie is intelligent, cautious, and fluent in 5 languages. But none of that matters. What matters is that she marries, behaves, and births an heir. She does. 1 daughter, no sons. But that's not the part people remember. What they remember is the end of her husband's life, and, in many ways, the end of hers. Because Rudolph, brilliant, depressive, and burdened by dynastic expectation, dies in a murder-suicide pact with his teenage mistress at Mayerling, a royal hunting lodge just outside Vienna. Stephanie is not there. She is left to pick up the pieces, humiliated and publicly sidelined. From that moment on, her place in the empire becomes less than secure. A widow at 25, a mother of a daughter no one considered important, a woman with royal blood but no further use to the machine. You walk beside her through the decades that follow. She tries to regain relevance, publishes a memoir, marries a Hungarian count, gasp, beneath her station. She becomes something of a curiosity, a footnote from a failed future. And here's the bitter irony. Stephanie had done everything right. Married young, played the part, had a child, endured a husband she barely knew. And still, the system left her behind. No second chances for royal daughters who couldn't produce heirs, or whose husbands brought disgrace instead of glory. Historians still argue whether Rudolph's mental instability came from the pressure of succession, personal despair, or something deeper, something in the bloodline itself. His family, after all, had a history of depression, suicide, and erratic behavior. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, had her own demons. His grandfather, Franz Karl, was considered unfit to rule. His cousins, anxious, reclusive, or bizarre. The Habsburg cocktail, equal parts trauma and tradition. You follow Stephanie's daughter, too. Elizabeth Marie, known as the Red Archduchess, a rebel, socialist, married outside nobility, estranged from her family. She rejected the palace and everything it stood for. She had seen firsthand what it did to her mother, what it had done to her father, and she wanted no part of it. But how many royal daughters had that option? How many could say no to the machine? You pause at a shelf filled with royal yearbooks, lists of engagements, births, and treaties. The girls are all there. Stephanie, Marie Valerie, Louise, Gisela, pages of them, and yet their stories are reduced to a line or two. Married to, died at age, entered convent in. Even the chaos at Mayerling is flattened in the official record. Just a line. Crown Prince Rudolph deceased, 1889. No context, no scandal, no whisper of the shattered girl left behind. You return to that station, now empty. The tracks are rusted, the lamps unlit. But the pattern persists. Royal daughters sent far from home, sacrificed to the ambitions of men whose dynasties were already rotting from within. Stephanie was one of the last of her kind, a noble daughter whose fate was sealed not by what she wanted, but by what she represented. And in the end, even that wasn't enough. She died in 1945, nearly forgotten, living quietly in Hungary as bombs fell around the final ruins of the old European empires. The world had changed. The palaces were crumbling. The portraits were fading. But her story, and the stories of girls like her, still hum beneath the wallpaper of history. You step away from the station platform and into the fog. Another daughter, another sacrifice, another woman who did everything asked, and was still written out of the script before the curtain fell. The wind is colder now. You've left the grandeur of palaces and stations and found yourself in a manicured cemetery just outside Vienna. Habsburg territory, still, but quieter. The Capuchin crypt lies ahead, its entrance humble, almost apologetic. You descend slowly. Candles flicker on the stone steps, the air dense with centuries of dust, wax, and quiet regret. Down here, the dead Habsburgs line the walls. Their metal sarcophagi are adorned with crowns, skulls, wings, cherubs, and sorrow. This isn't a crypt. It's a dynasty in pieces. And tucked among the emperors and generals, you find the coffins of the daughters, the silent casualties of ambition. They don't get the grand statues. Some aren't even listed in tour guides. You see names like Maria Caroline, Maria Johanna, Maria Antonia. They blur together in your mind, each one born into impossible expectations, each one gone too soon. One coffin is especially small, decorated with a rose and an engraving of a girl who died at age 10. A Habsburg princess, of course. Her records list her as delicate, blessed, angelic. What they don't list are the seizures, the breathing troubles, the learning difficulties that were whispered about in Latin. You sit for a moment in the flickering light, and it's hard not to feel the weight of it. These girls didn't just die of illness. They died of inattention, of being vessels rather than individuals. No one bothered to ask if their bodies were strong enough to carry dynasties. They were born, baptized, betrothed, and then buried. Take Maria Theresa's other daughters, not the famous ones, not Marie Antoinette or Maria Carolina, the others. Maria Elizabeth, for example, nicknamed Liesel by her siblings. She was considered beautiful, lively, a real prospect for alliance. Then she caught smallpox, was left scarred, and immediately removed from marriage plans. She lived out her days in quiet exile, used as a stand-in hostess at court events, like fine silver, brought out for holidays, but never truly needed. Another daughter, Maria Josefa, was on her way to becoming Queen of France, engaged to the Dauphin no less, until smallpox took her. Not just her life, but her legacy. Her sister, Antonia, yes, Marie Antoinette, took her place in the alliance as though the girls were interchangeable. And that's the part that never softens, no matter how many candlelit walls you walk past. The sense that royal daughters were always replaceable. Another portrait, another dowry, another womb. You rise now and step into a chamber filled with urns. These hold the hearts of royals, a Habsburg custom, the body in one place, the heart in another, the guts elsewhere. It's supposed to symbolize devotion, spiritual connection, duty. But tonight, it just feels fragmented, like everything in their lives was divided, dissected, and displayed. You reach the heart urn of a girl named Archduchess Maria Clementina. Not widely remembered. Born to Emperor Francis II, She lived into adulthood, was married to a Bourbon prince, and reportedly died quietly. But behind the Latin phrases and stiff portraits, her diaries hint at sadness, confusion, homesickness. She miscarried repeatedly. The doctors blamed her nerves or her uterus. No one blamed the family tree. Historians still debate how much of the chronic illness and early death seen in these royal daughters was genetic versus environmental. Were they sick because of inbreeding, or because they were cloistered indoors, tightly corseted, underfed, overpressured, and never permitted a normal moment of movement or expression? And if it wasn't genetics, it was grief. If not physical weakness, emotional exhaustion. If not scandal, silence. You exit the crypt into the early morning light, your breath fogging in the chill. Above ground, Vienna is waking up. Cafes opening, trams rumbling. The empire is long gone, but the ghosts remain. In family trees that twist like ivy. In portraits with expressions just a little too tight. In the aching realization that every royal daughter was a gamble, and most lost the game before they even knew they were playing. One marble inscription reads, simply, "She was good, and she obeyed." No dates, no titles, just that. You wonder if she ever screamed into a pillow. You're in a library now. Not just any library, but the Hofburg Palace's imperial one. It's massive, echoing, steeped in dust and reverence. Marble statues of long-dead monarchs gaze down as you wander the endless aisles. But you're not here for philosophy or diplomacy. You're hunting for the royal daughters who vanished into the footnotes. You run your fingers along the spines of leather-bound tomes. Treaties of Vienna, marriages of the Holy Roman Empire, genealogies of European houses, all precise, all clean, all bloodless. And yet, beneath every neat line of descent lies a woman who probably cried into her wedding veil. This is where you find Princess Isabella of Parma, married off at 18 to Archduke Joseph of Austria. An intellectual, fluent in multiple languages, passionate about science, even interested in early feminist texts. She was, by all accounts, ahead of her time, and doomed anyway. She suffered severe depression, something her letters describe in alarming detail. She feared childbirth. She feared the court. She feared losing her mind, but she had no outlet. Her husband adored her, but his love could not rearrange the system she was caught in. She gave birth to 2 daughters, then a third child, a stillbirth, and then she died at age 22. One of her surviving letters reads, "I long to disappear like a snowflake on stone, brief, untraceable." You sit with that for a while. Try to imagine being that self-aware, that young, and still utterly trapped. You walk deeper into the library and find another story. Archduchess Matilda of Austria, a favorite of Emperor Franz Joseph. Charming, elegant, engaged to a prince. But one night, she tries to sneak a cigarette in a dress soaked in flammable chemicals. The dress catches fire. She dies in agony. She's 18. It sounds like a tragic accident, but some whisper it was more than that. Was she anxious? Rebellious? Was the pressure of the impending marriage too much? Historians still argue whether it was carelessness or desperation. The result, either way, was another empty place at the royal table. And no one changed the system. You pass cabinets filled with family crests and titles, meticulously recorded. But what isn't recorded? The illnesses, the miscarriages, the phantom pregnancies, the breakdowns, the whispered instructions to keep her from the guests, the diagnoses that didn't have names yet. Because the further you go into these royal lineages, the more you see how predictably the story repeats. A girl is born, groomed, dressed, displayed, married, forgotten. Sometimes she's lucky, like Empress Zita of Bourbon Parma, who lived through the fall of the empire and died old, respected, and opinionated. But even she lost her husband early and spent most of her life in exile, raising 8 children on the run from the remains of Europe's ambitions. Most didn't even get that far. Some faded so fast they weren't even buried near the others. One grave in Prague simply reads, Anna, Archduchess, short-lived. You find one last diary tucked away in a locked drawer. It's in shaky German script, unsigned, but clearly the musings of a royal teenage girl. She writes about her frustration with embroidery, her disgust at being measured for gowns she'll never choose. She writes about wanting to cut off all her hair and run into the woods. She writes, I don't know who I am when I am not someone's daughter. And maybe that's the heart of it. These women were never allowed to be more than daughters. Their identities were frozen at birth, their fates wrapped in ribbon and sealed with a signet ring. You close the diary and look up at the shelves. So many names, so few stories told. You imagine them sitting in these rooms, reading, dreaming, fidgeting with worry or boredom, hoping someone might see them not as pawns, but as people. And maybe tonight, just for a little while, you do. The halls are empty now, the candles low. You've wandered deep into the family tree and come out the other side, blinking. But before the night ends, there's one more daughter waiting for you, arguably the most famous of them all, the one whose name has become myth, tragedy, and TikTok aesthetic. Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, born into opulence, silks, Fabergé eggs, and blinding chandeliers, but also born into a world teetering on collapse. Russia in the early 20th century wasn't a place for princesses. Revolution was brewing. Trust in the monarchy was cracking. And in the middle of it all, a clever, willful teenage girl trying to make people laugh at dinner. You walk into her room at the Alexander Palace, still preserved, as if she just stepped out. Embroidered pillows, favorite books, a sketch of a dog on her writing desk. You can almost hear her teasing her older sisters, playing pranks on her tutors, making faces behind the back of the court photographer. But Anastasia wasn't just a mischievous teen. She was also a royal daughter in the pressure cooker of a collapsing empire. She was told to be poised, elegant, devout, and yet she never quite fit the mold. Too funny, too brash, too modern. And then, everything falls apart. The Russian Revolution explodes. Her father abdicates. The family is imprisoned. Their world, once gilt and marble, turns gray and cold. No more servants. No more tiaras. Just rationed bread, whispered rumors, and the same dresses worn again and again. You follow her through Tobolsk, then Yekaterinburg. Letters from this time are haunting. Scrawled notes full of hope that a cousin might intervene, or that exile might come instead of execution. But no help came. In July 1918, the Romanovs were taken to a basement. You don't need every detail. Just know that it was quick, brutal, and final. The last imperial family of Russia, gone in minutes. Anastasia, just 17. And then came the mystery. Because for decades afterward, rumors persisted. Survivors claimed Anastasia had escaped. Imposters stepped forward. The most famous, Anna Anderson, convinced many. Even members of the Romanov extended family believed her for a time. It wasn't until DNA testing in the early 2000s that the case was finally closed. Anastasia had not survived. She had been buried, like the others, in a shallow forest grave. But you understand why people clung to that sliver of hope, however fragile, that maybe, just maybe, one story could end differently. That amid centuries of arranged marriages, miscarriages, migraines, and masked sorrow, one royal daughter might have slipped through the cracks of history and carved her own path. It wasn't just about Anastasia. It was about every daughter who had vanished quietly behind velvet curtains and locked gates. Hope, after all, is the last luxury even monarchies can't regulate. But you understand why people clung to that sliver of hope. That maybe, in a world that swallowed so many royal daughters whole, under velvet, under protocol, under pressure, one girl might have escaped. That maybe not every story ended in a convent, or a crypt, or the slow suffocation of duty. That perhaps, in some dim-lit corner of the world, a royal daughter threw off her title, changed her name, and lived. Because to accept that none of them did is to accept how efficient the system truly was. You leave Anastasia behind and return to the long procession of daughters, thousands of them, across centuries, borders, languages. Not just Habsburgs or Romanovs. Bourbons, Valois, Plantagenets, Wittelsbachs. Their stories form a quiet chorus behind the louder ones. For every Catherine the Great, there were 10 princesses named Maria who lived and died unremembered. You picture them all now, lined up in a corridor of time, some in white satin wedding gowns, others in nuns' habits, a few in military uniforms, disguised to escape, most in corsets, all in expectation. You remember Princess Charlotte of Belgium, sister of Leopold II. She married into Mexico, became empress briefly, until her husband was executed. After that, she returned to Europe and slowly lost her mind. She spent the next 60 years wandering the halls of Belgian estates, whispering to shadows, still addressed as Your Majesty. Madness wasn't punished. It was pitied, as long as it stayed quiet. Or Archduchess Gisela of Austria, daughter of Emperor Franz Joseph. She actually fared well by royal standards. Married a prince of Bavaria, kept her head down, raised her children, and managed to outlive her era with dignity. She's the exception that proves the rule. Survival. For a royal daughter usually meant invisibility. Even Queen Victoria's daughters weren't spared. Princess Alice lost her son to hemophilia, caught diphtheria herself, and died before age 36. Her daughter, Alexandra, became the last Tsarina of Russia, married into tragedy. Historians still argue whether the weight placed on these women was cultural, structural, or simply unavoidable. Whether the fault lies with kings, courts, customs, or all of the above. What's certain is this: the royal daughter, for most of history, was born with a script already written. Her body, her mind, her choices, they were never hers alone. And yet, they found moments of rebellion. Tiny, sparkling ones. A princess who wrote secret poetry in a forbidden language. Another who had her portrait painted in armor instead of lace. One who arranged her own education in science, hiding math books under devotional texts. A few who refused to marry, flatly, publicly, and survived the fallout. They weren't always loud, but they were there. You walk past their faint footprints, still visible beneath the polished floors. And for every daughter who bowed her head, one lifted her chin, even if only in private. You arrive now at the final hallway, where time feels strange, like it's folding in on itself. You see Marie Antoinette as a child, carefree, curious, long before Versailles. You see Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, smiling in Spain, unaware she's carrying the hemophilia gene that will devastate generations. You see little Princess Elizabeth of Bavaria, later Empress Sisi, still wild-haired and defiant, long before the weight of the empire settled on her spine. And then, nothing. No trumpets, no grand finale, just a soft silence. The empire is gone. The palaces are museums. The daughters have become myths, or not even that, just faded names on dusty family trees. But tonight, you remembered them. You walked the long corridors. You listened where few ever do. So as you reach the end of their story, you give them what they rarely received in life: attention, reflection, care. You pause by one last plaque. No name, no title, just a date. A life that barely flickered. But tonight, it burns a little longer in your memory. And now, as the story quiets and the halls grow still, you let the echoes fade. The palace walls, once so heavy with expectation, dissolve into softness. The portraits dimension. The cold marble floors warm slightly underfoot. You take one last slow breath in that candlelit corridor, no longer a witness, just a traveler passing through outside. The night is gentle. A breeze stirs the trees that line the old imperial gardens. You imagine the royal daughters there, not in gowns, not in titles, but as girls again, laughing, barefoot, free from silk and ceremony, unburdened by alliances or heirs or family crests. Let that be your final image. Let them walk into dreams, not duty. And let your own thoughts slow alongside theirs, because the clocks of history can tick so loudly, but sleep asks for something softer. So tonight, you release the weight of all those lives folded into lineage. You leave behind the bloodlines and the burdens, the crowns and the crypts. You let go of the names, the marriages, the mourning veils, all of it. They rest now, and so should you. The past has been heard. You've listened. And now there is nothing more to do. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breath come slower. Let the hush of history settle gently over your shoulders like a velvet cloak. No more ceremony. No more questions. Only quiet. Only calm. Only rest. Sweet dreams.